Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. The main purpose of Global Connections Television is to promote a discussion of major international issues and problems that affect people around the world. Another goal is to help us to think about how we can work on these problems together and to really make a difference in creating a better world. Today we're going to take a look at the roles of trade and development and how important they are both in developed and developing countries to raise the standard of living and improve the quality of life. We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at the roles of trade and development and how really important they are, especially in both developed and developing countries. My guest today is going to bring us up to date on the United Nations agency, UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development that focuses on these issues. My guest today is Ms. Chantal Carpentier, a Canadian national who is the New York office chief for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, commonly called UNCTAD. Dr. Chantal Carpentier has a distinguished career and academic background in policy and development. Dr. Chantal Carpentier, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's start off with a very basic question. UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, what is it, when was it formed, and what's your basic mission?
That's a very good question because few people know. UNCTAD was created in 1964, and it was created as a result of the decolonization of countries and a lot of, especially African countries, joining the UN as new members and feeling that they didn't have a fair access to the trade system as they were and a fair voice at the UN. And so they created what was called at the time the G77, the group of 77 countries that were developing. And they had their first conference to look at their concern on trade and development in 1963, which was the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And they felt that they needed that capacity to continue this work, and therefore they created us as the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And we've been working since then with them on supporting the G77, which is now 133 countries, with their macroeconomic policies, the intergovernmental process on macroeconomics, and do technical cooperation with them at the country level as well. So
they've just about doubled in number. They've gone from G77 to 130 some odd countries. So moving onward and upward. These issues are so very important. I think you have 5 major issue areas that you're responsible for. That's the focal point for trade and development within the United Nations system. Let's just go through them very briefly and we'll come back and talk about it. But the first one is Africa, the least developed countries and special programs. What exactly is that?
That's a good question, Bill. And when you talk about the trade system, if you are a country in Africa, if you are a least developed country, which are some of the poorest country with a lot of poverty and a low development index, remoteness from markets, smaller markets, and low productive capacity, then it's much harder to take advantage of the trade system. If you are a country that is at war, it's very hard to take advantage of the trade system. So we do focus our work on developing countries, but with special focus on the least developed countries, the landlocked developed countries, the small island development state, and therefore focus the work that we do on what does it mean for these more challenged country to access and benefit from the trade system.
Exactly. And you have a recent report here on the least developed countries, a report of 2015. Not everything's in the report. What are one or two of the highlights in this report?
Well, what it is we produce flagship report every year on issues such as the least developed countries and trade and development system. And this one last year was specifically on rural development and the role of agriculture and of non-industrial production and then linking back the rural area to the industrial sector so that you can increase your export. And so the whole basis of that report is to trying to see how we can diversify the economy. A lot of these developed countries are dependent on one or two commodities. As we have seen lately, there's a drop in all commodity prices, agriculture, oil, all of them. And that means if you are depending heavily on one of those commodities for your GDP, that means your GDP grows down. You have very little resources to invest in infrastructure, in education, in health, and other issues, and further your capacity for production.
Exactly. That's a challenge when you depend upon a primary industry, be it oil or be it timber or mining or whatever the case might be. And it's very important to diversify, I guess, within any economy, is it not?
It is, and one of the definition of least developed countries is that they are not diversified. They have very little productive capacity, and therefore you're not resilient when you have economic shock, environmental shock, political shocks. Your resilience level is very low because you depend on one thing.
Exactly. Now, least developed countries, roughly how many are there? There are different categories of least developed, lesser developed.
How
does that work? I know it's confusing, right? But roughly how many are there?
The least developed countries, there's 48 of them. They're all listed in this report that you were pointing out. And a lot of them are in Africa. And they're defined by a low GDP, a gross national income of less than $1,200 approximately, and a human development index as well as a economic index. So when they meet the criteria for these three, they're least developed countries. And at the UN and at UNCTAD, what we're trying to do is to help these countries graduate from LDCs so that they can become middle income country, which is another category that we have. And the reason we had created the LDC to start with is because of their special challenges. We had helped change the rule at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, so that these least developed countries could have quota-free, tariff-free access to the market. Now we're in 2016, there's quite a bit of liberalization of the market, but when we started, there was quite a bit of tariffs on export and imports. And therefore, the idea was to create a category of countries that should be treated a bit more to have it easier to access the trade system, let's put it this way.
Exactly, which is very critical. Now our viewers can go to your website, www.unctad.org, excuse me, to get more information on this report and many other reports, and a couple of them we'll talk about today. So let's move to that second point, globalization, interdependence, and development. What do you mean by that, and how do you focus on those particular problems?
Yeah, and we also produce a report, which I believe you're holding there from that division, which is the Trade and Development Report, which is a bit of a misnomer, because what it looks is at the debt and the systemic issue in the financial market. And for instances, you'll be pleased to know that in this report we focus on the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the three phases we went through, and where do we stand right now, and have we solved the problem? Are we out of it or not? And the short answer is we're not. We're growth is still below what it was before the crisis. Production is increasing, but trade is not increasing as fast. That means there's a little bit of protectionism happening, which often will disadvantage the least developed countries. And also, we have seen that we started by, if you recall in 2008, all the government had stimulus packages to try to stimulate the economy so that we wouldn't fall in a recession. And then we went with Europe having a bit of the austerity measures and relying on monetary policies. And then the developing countries in those terms, they were still holding up. They were still doing good, but they were having counter-cyclical policies to avoid the impact of the crisis. And now we're in the third phase that report shows, where the money is coming out now of the financial flows are coming out of the least developed countries and the emerging economies, wreaking havoc with their exchange rates and really destabilizing their financial and their economic system.
What can be done to try to help encourage people to put money back into these countries that need investment? They need reverse economic investment so they can develop businesses, whatever the case might be, and to expand and to actually have a thriving economy. Are there suggestions in the report that what countries can do?
They are, and mostly they can work together at the regional level to try to help stabilize their exchange rate, their money. But there's others. But it also linked to a third division that we have, which is investment in entrepreneurship. And in that division, what we're looking at is how to help country attract investment. And now with the adoption of Agenda 2030, what we're trying to do is not only to mobilize and attract investment, but attract investment that will go in through these 16 goals, because the 17th one is the means of implementation. One big one is investment. But how do we ensure that the investment not only come to these countries, but help with these goals, which would then create inclusive growth and sustainable growth? And so we have a whole division that is actually looking, and we have an investment policy framework for the SDGs that we just reviewed and was launched last year at the Financing for Development Forum conference. And basically that really help member states step by step. How do you go about reviewing your investment policies, reviewing your trade policies, reviewing your entrepreneurship policies, and making such that you have an environment that attract investment, but also attract the right type of investment that will have a multiplier effect in the economy and also support the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals.
And you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of them. As you mentioned, you're focusing on 16 in particular, but it's very important to try to eliminate all forms of poverty, to eliminate hunger, to empower women, to combat climate change, to deal with the issues that are so important to all of us in the United States and around the world, to developed countries, regardless of where it may be. You mentioned the 2008 collapse, and that was absolutely devastating. It started in the United States. There were, for many reasons we could talk about today, but several mistakes were made. There was no oversight of a lot of agencies. There were bubbles developing in the housing market and different things like that. But this impact has just been absolutely devastating to people in many parts of the world. And is there some way we can help put in place machinery? I know many countries are concerned about it. The U.S. talks about it. What can be done to make sure we don't have another financial collapse? Is there something you can do to get people to cooperate on this, to get businesses, the financial systems, to work together, governments, whatever, everybody who has an interest in this to really try to promote sustainable economic development is what I guess we should say instead of speculation to a large degree?
Well, it's a very good question, and of course we are a UN agency, so what our role is to bring member states together with the private sector, with the civil society group, and have them discuss this. We do the research, we provide recommendation, and we provide evidence-based analysis and recommendation that they can then use. We, of course, the member state make the decision of what they're going to do. But just to give you an example, we had the World Investment Forum, which is kind of the Davos of economic, but for investment, in Geneva in 2014, where we had 3,000 representatives from 150 countries, including the the head of the stock exchanges around the world, several heads of state, ministers, to talk exactly about that. How do we prevent another financial crisis? How do we put bounds and checks so that as we see things moving, we can actually intervene before things get too dire? And there are several steps that could be taken, including, as you were mentioning earlier, some of the regulatory of the financial system and reducing the volatility of, for example, in the trading system, in the trading, I'm talking in the stock market now. So the volatility that comes out of there, the volatility that comes from the large investment in some of the commodities that then plummeted. And then that means the price moved very substantially. And so what our role is to help member states think about these things and capacitate the developing countries, which may not have the same sophistication in analysis in all of these issues than the US or some other countries, so they can actually negotiate with a more of an equal balance, if you want. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately financed, independently produced program
The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view some of our previous programs. Also, if you're involved in any type of media outlet, be it a public broadcasting service, community access television, a website, whatever it might be, if you have viewers who have an interest in these international issues, please feel free to go to the website, pull down the programs, and distribute them free of charge. Global Connections Television is a public service at no cost to help people better understand these important issues. Today we're talking about trade and development and a UN agency, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which is very involved in these particular issues. My guest today is an expert on UNCTAD. My guest today is Dr. Chantal Carpentier, who is the chief of the New York office for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We're talking about your 5 goals, and goal number 3, as I recall, deals with international trade in commodities. Ever since people have moved from any place in the world, there's been international trade, I guess, if you cross a country line or whatever the line might be, a geographical boundary. But what do you focus on in that area?
Well, we focus on several things. One of the issue with some developing countries, they have a higher cost. For instance, their customs system is not up to date. So we help them modernize their customs system. So it's easy to collect export taxes or import taxes, reduce corruption. We also help them invest in and design their port capacity, if they're not a landlocked country, so that they can actually, again, reduce the cost of trade. We also capacitate them with productive capacity. What is it that you should focus on? What is which industrial policy should they have based on the skill that they have, the labor force that they have, and where they are in the marketplace? This is a huge globe that we have, and so help them, work with them on identifying these areas that they maybe want to focus, 1 or 2 areas they want to focus on, so to trade. We've worked, for instances, with the climate change deal now that has been agreed upon, on greening their economy, on developing their green markets, so that as these markets develop, they're not behind. They can actually leapfrog and provide renewable energy and provide agricultural organic products or shade-grown coffee or organic coffee or cacao and benefit from those markets.
Exactly. Every country has to find its niche. It has to find what it does best, what are some of the activities, enterprises that it can develop. And that leads me to the next one, investment in enterprise. That's your 4th area of concern. What exactly is this, and what are you doing in that area?
Well, I was saying earlier, Bill, we do investment policy. So we support member state on their investment policy. So they ask us and say, well, is this investment policy I have, is it going to foster having more foreign direct investment coming? And is it going to go to the right sectors? And is it going to be helping to be bringing everybody? Is it going to reach everybody? Or is it going to be only favoring the sectors already good and people that have already a lot of money? So that's one thing. The second thing is on entrepreneurship. There's a lot of unemployment right now in the world, especially amongst the youth. So what we're trying to do is we have a entrepreneurship policy framework where we help countries to review their entrepreneurship policies, the access to finance for entrepreneurs, the red tape for entrepreneur and registration, so reduce informality. We also work with member states in terms of their investment agreements that they're signing. What are they signing on? What does that mean? And as you know, there's these investment state dispute resolution that are in these investment agreement, where if a government put in place certain laws, then the company that have invested in that country feel it's reducing its profit, they can sue the government directly. And that has created several billions of dollars of payment over time. And member states now are realizing that maybe those needs to be revised because there's going to be a lot of policies put in place for achieving Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. And you don't want to feel like there's something a shadow over your head that maybe you're going to be sued because you put a policy in place. So we also looking at reforming the investment state dispute resolution policies out there.
Mm-hmm. to have a legal suit against you would have a dampening effect. To put it mildly, that would certainly be something that anybody would want to enter into, I'm sure. Do you get into, you were talking about import, export taxes, things like that, revenue development. Do you get into subsidies? For example, I'm just thinking of subsidies like it's been reported that the fossil fuel industries get like $500 billion a year. Now, maybe that's wrong, but I've read those figures in subsidies from various countries around the world, and the alternative forms of energy, such as wind, solar, and what have you, get nowhere near that. But if you were to level that playing field, and green energy is already coming online. Solar is becoming very competitive right now, even without all the subsidies. But do you get into the area of subsidies?
We do a little bit, but it's mostly the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that monitor that, because it's part of the rules of the WTO not to put subsidies where you're not supposed to. What we do, on the other hand, though, is we look at the tariffs and non-tariff barriers that are put in place to prevent access to markets to developing countries. So for instance, sometimes some of these green policies can be an impediment. If you are only going to buy organic product and I don't have the capacity to train my farmers to be organic and be certified, that blocks access to my market. That's a specific example. But as we're going to put more of these, as we green trade, we need to make sure, or we green our economy, we need to make sure that we provide the capacity for developing countries to keep up with these standards so they don't face these non-tariff measures that prevent them from accessing to trade. So that's more what we focus on, because the WTO focus on the subsidy side.
Exactly. These are very tricky issues. It's not, they're not black and white, that's for sure. That's right. Now, the last one is trade and technology, I believe, logistics? No, technology and trade and logistics. What exactly is that?
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how to facilitate trade to member states, for member states, especially the developing countries. And it's not just these developed countries. We also do Latin America, which are mostly middle-income countries. Sure. But we basically, on the logistic, part of logistic is basically marine access, connectivity, transport within the regional area. For instance, there's a lot of lack of infrastructure within Africa for African countries to trade amongst themselves. And perhaps that if they could trade amongst themselves, they could all take part of the same supply chain, so that now at the regional level, they get a greater part of the revenue from that supply chain, and therefore increase the revenues for the region. So that's the area, that's the logistic part. In terms of ICT and science, technology, innovation, and information technology, we are the substantive secretariat. We provide the substantive work on the Commission on the Science and Technology for Development at the United Nations. And we were heavily involved with our other colleagues to support the World Summit on Information Society that we just concluded in December. Why? Because increasingly the economy is going live online. You have e-commerce, you have a lot of technology, everything is robotic and informatic. And so there is an inherent difficulty if you don't have broadband access to take part of that new economy. And therefore we are trying to work to bridge that divide, where often the youth, the women, the most marginalized people have least access to this broadband, and therefore cannot take advantage of the new economy, which is, we see it here, we see it everywhere, it's becoming prominent.
Exactly. And that leads right into an area that's of great interest to, I think, a large number of people who deal with these issues. How do we deal with it? How do folks who have been involved in the area for years and years of the issues, but also how do you get the young people involved? How do you get folks who are going to be the leaders of tomorrow to really learn more about what UNCTAD is doing, and to try to really play a hands-on role as far as dealing with these particular problems and helping to create this better world that we keep talking about? Is this one way we can do it, and are there other ways we can get the youth involved?
And it's a very good question, and I would say that in my previous life, I was at the at the DESA Division for Sustainable Development, who organized Rio Plus 20, and starting with Rio Plus 20, and going on to the negotiation for the SDGs, we scaled up tremendously, like we've never had, through the ICT, the participation of all civil society. Now when we signed the MDGs in 2000, very few people knew about them. It took years before people knew about them. Now in most countries, especially the youth, are involved, they're engaged, they know what the SDGs are, they know what's in it for them. And they really want their government to implement them, and they want to be part of the solution. So our role is to empower them to do that. We're going to have a youth forum at our upcoming quadrennial ministerial meeting where we're going to be talking about these macroeconomic issues, and member states are going to decide how UNCTAD can further contribute to the SDGs. And we want to hear from the youth, what is their role, what can we do to support them, and how can we all work together on these things? None of us can achieve the SDGs alone. The other thing I must say is that with the Commonwealth, we also just released I talked to you about the entrepreneurship policy framework earlier. With the Commonwealth, we just released one that's totally adapted to the youth entrepreneurship. Because youth have different constraints. For instance, they're not likely to have any experience on entrepreneurship. They even depend more on mentorship and an apprenticeship. So we develop a full program and with examples where member states can go step by step on how to develop entrepreneurship policies that stimulate entrepreneurship amongst the youth in their countries.
Well, Dr. Chantal Carpentier, these are extremely important issues, and again, we would encourage everybody to go to your website at www.unctad.org and really try to learn more about these issues, because they are so very vital to us, and they don't get nearly the publicity that they need to, so that we, as people who want to participate in the process, can do it. But it is very important that we learn about these, and I'm delighted that you brought us up to date on exactly what you've been doing on this, what you've done in the past, and what you're going to be doing in the future, and to help us better understand it. But again, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We believe macroeconomics needs to be better understood.
Critically important. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.